Wow, it's wonderful to have all of you here, and an honor for us at Columbia University to be hosting you and many friends from China and Australia and Africa and overseas in many places. I want to say a word about Jerry Chazen, who I don't think is here with us today. Is he? No, okay. Jerry's was a longtime trustee of Columbia University and a great business person and a person with a profound concern for the world, for the arts, for business, and he obviously made a marvelous contribution by establishing this center at Columbia Business School, and I just wanted to pay tribute to his leadership for doing that. Hi, Merit. How are you? So I know that you had a wonderful discussion today already in the internal roundtable, and I'm delighted to be a brief opening act for a great panel. I'll just speak for a few minutes. And I won't speak mainly about this extraordinary topic of China's own outward foreign investment, which is by itself a game changer. Everything about China deserves superlatives in terms of its rate of change and its scale of impact. And the stock of outward foreign investment, we know, is one of those superlatives, having risen roughly tenfold within a decade from 2000 to 2010. Everything about China's growth, though, has been a world changer. And I'm at least of that school that says this is fundamental. It is not a bubble. It's not something that's going to be reversed. It's part of an underlying very deep trend of catching up of China after, you could say, 200 years or 150 years of not such great luck, or you could date it to 1433 if you want and say a few hundred years more than that. But China is catching up, and because of its size and importance and fundamental role in global culture and science, technology, and history, it's changing the entire world. There's nothing more important in the world economy over the past generation, and I would say the next generation, than China's development. Some of the numbers you know, but I think they bear mentioning. In 1980, according to the IMF's data, the U.S. was 24.6% of the global GDP measured in purchasing power terms, and China was 2.2% of the world GDP. This year, the IMF has estimated that the U.S. has gone from 24.6 to 19.8%, whereas China has gone from 2.2% to 15%. And on the estimates of the IMF out to 2017, of course, to be taken with the wide band of uncertainty, the IMF puts the U.S. at 17.7%, down from 19.8%, and puts China at 18.3%, in other words, larger than the U.S. already by 2017. This is of fundamental transformation significance. It has many implications. For inside China, probably the most dramatic is that in 1980, the poverty rate in China, measured by the World Bank's poverty level, was 73.5% poverty rate in 1980. And according to the World Bank's most recent estimate of 2008, the poverty rate was at 7.4%. There is no doubt in my mind that material conditions for the overwhelming majority of people in China have improved phenomenally and in an unprecedented manner, at an unprecedented speed and magnitude in the 30 years after 1980. Now, there's another side to it which is very significant, and that is that in 1980, U.S. carbon dioxide emissions were 4.9 billion tons, and China's were 1.4 billion tons, less than a third of the U.S., and in per capita terms, therefore, less than a 12th of America's. By 2009, China had overtaken the U.S. to become the world's largest carbon dioxide emitter and the largest emitter of greenhouse gases overall. As of 2009, China emitted 6.8 billion tons of CO2 compared to the U.S. 5.2 billion tons. China, more than any other part of the world, will determine the future health of the planet and the future of climate change and our ability to get it under control. Something of significance for the whole world, but of fundamental significance for China itself, because there are few places in the world more vulnerable than China as a highly populous, not only populous, densely populated country with roughly 19 or 20% of the world's population and about 7% of the world's land area and something like 7% of the world's water supply, and not evenly distributed within China. Climate change will have huge impacts within China, and China's the main driver in the world right now. By no means the only one, but it's about a quarter of total emissions. So it seems to me that China not only is making fundamental changes, but has become not only an important player, but a key driver of fundamental global scale development at this point. And I want to mention 4 of them and then talk about the coming 2 weeks because they're of significance for the world in many ways. First, China has fundamentally affected the global division of labor. And my own view is that a lot of the slow growth in the United States and in Europe has its counterpart in China's fast growth. That's an unpopular view. Some of my colleagues at Columbia University will consider me absolutely heretical for saying it. I'm not saying that China did anything wrong. I'm just saying that the rapid rise of manufacturing, highly profitable in China, had as its counterpart some hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing over the last 30 years. And to think that it didn't, to my mind, would be surprising. U.S. employment in manufacturing declined from 19 million to 11 million jobs from 1980 till basically now. And while some of that is general technological change, some of that is the loss of competitiveness, especially to China, but to the emerging economies in general. This doesn't mean that globalization isn't good or the trade isn't good. It's just one facet of how an adjustment to this phenomenally important economic transformation is taking place. And my own view is that some of the slow growth that Japan began to experience 20 years ago and the slow growth that the United States has experienced in the last 10 years and in Europe as well was partly the phenomenon that in this tradable goods industry, China was more competitive and had higher returns, and there was a tremendous, on the margin, a tremendous shift of new production capacity and so forth that had a global scale effect. Now, China's also had a global scale effect in spurring Africa's growth and in spurring Latin America's growth in the last 10 years. I think it's been the major reason for the higher growth rates in the primary commodity exporting regions, which have both experienced a tremendous last decade. I should add, by the way, in my own way of thinking, that the United States and Europe already experienced a significant slowing down of job growth 15 years ago. And part of it was this tremendous burst of success of China, and I'm not begrudging it for a moment. I just want to be very clear about this. I'm just describing. I applaud China's success completely, but one of the ways that the U.S. reacted to the weakening of jobs in the tradable sector was by trying to spur jobs in the non-traded sector, especially construction. So it's not, in my opinion, a complete accident that we had a housing bubble in the 2000s, because the Fed put the accelerator on in order to overcome chronic labor market weakness in a significant part of our economy. And this is a policy follow-on to how globalization has evolved. And my own view is the United States has done a miserable job of understanding globalization and responding effectively to it. And it has responded through creating bubbles and a boomlet in construction, which has more than disappeared, obviously, and it has not been able to focus on real competitiveness and a real long-term strategy that is compatible with the new world economy. The second thing that China has done is create a completely new environment of almost all primary commodities. Whether this survives or not depends on whether we have a collapse of the world economy or not, and I'll come to that in a moment. But since around 2004, all primary commodity classes have experienced a dramatic increase of real prices. This is in agriculture, in staples and non-staple agriculture, it's in virtually all minerals, and it's in hydrocarbons. This is an astounding change. Now, it's only 8 years in the making. It's had two cyclical declines, 2009 and 2012. So there have been corrections as the world economy has weakened. But my view is that we've entered an age of high real primary commodities prices on a persisting basis. If that's the case, it's nearly unprecedented in modern economic history, because 150 years was characterized by gradually declining real prices of commodities. And my view is basically that the world economy has gotten very crowded. The planet has not gotten bigger, but the world economy has gotten bigger, and it's pressing hard against conventional supplies and land and water and many of the other underpinnings of agricultural production, minerals production, and conventional oil production. And that this is therefore a fundamental driver. Other people disagree with that. We don't have a long enough time series to prove this one way or another. If the world economy were to collapse because of a financial crisis, for example, that starts in Europe next Sunday and then becomes a worldwide crisis, and it's not impossible, commodities prices will go down. What I'm saying is that at a nearly full employment world economy, commodities prices will be high in real terms compared to historical norms, and this is because, most importantly, the rise of China, but more generally, the rise of the world economy and the fact that the emerging economies have really emerged. The third aspect of this that I think is fundamental is what the geologists call the age of the Anthropocene, what some ecologists call the planetary boundaries, what we call the challenge of sustainable development, and that is that we do not have a world system and a set of technologies in place that can accommodate the kind of growth that we expect in the world economy in a sustainable manner. So if China continues to grow rapidly, and that might mean 6 or 7% per year rather than 10% per year, but if it does it following mainly the development track that it's following, which means lots of automobiles and big automobile-based cities, the world will absolutely, and I would include China within the world, face a crisis within decades of unprecedented severity and complication, because climate change, water scarcity, loss of biodiversity, ocean acidification, and many other human-driven, anthropogenic forcings on the world will create havoc. They're already creating havoc but not in the core economies right now. They're creating havoc in the weak places in the world. Already the Horn of Africa and the Sahel are virtually unlivable and ungovernable for tens of millions of people. And that is in part because they are very dry. And that is in part because the dry places in the world, like those places, are getting drier right now, because that's what one would expect from climate change. And we're already seeing catastrophe from this, but it will spread to more core parts of the world. I'm also considering Texas not a core part of the world, but some odd periphery with some very strange ideas that somehow emanate even to New York on occasion. But Texas is having one of its greatest droughts of modern history. And this is, in, I think, best evidence, a reflection of a deeper ecological footprint. China's will be the major player in this change. This is not to say that there's something especially pernicious about China's role in this, because from a per capita point of view, the United States is much larger in its contributions to these changes. But China is big, and it is coal-based, and it needs food, and it's got water scarcity, and it imports a lot of feed grains, and it does a lot of things that affect the anthropogenic drivers all over the world, the most important of which is its CO2 emissions. The fourth point that I would say a fundamental change, of course, is geopolitics. China is simply central to global developments now, politically, militarily, security, economic, financial. And I think, in my own interpretation, this was not China's timetable. China wants 30 more years of quiet so that it can finish the catching up. It wants to be a good global citizen. It wants to have a world that is accommodative to continued rapid growth. Chinese leaders and the Chinese people know that China is still a middle-income country, not an economic powerhouse. There still is tremendous difficulty and fragility internally. And my own surmise is that from the Chinese leaders' point of view, the greatest thing in the world would be quiet for another 20 or 25 years. China is a good system player, in my opinion, which is that it wants to follow the rules, support multilateral institutions. It just wants also energy, food, and other things that it needs, and it wants the time to grow. But I don't think the world timetable will fit this hope anymore. China's too large not to be a major protagonist, not just a background supporter. And this will certainly be the case when China is the world's largest economy, which, if it's not 2017, will be 2020 or 2025. And it is already the case when China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And so, and voracious in its appetite for coal, oil, copper, iron ore, and many other things. Now, all of this could change if China went into a crisis. I believe China will not go into such a crisis, and that this was not a bubble that's going to burst and we're all going to rub our eyes and say, how could we ever have believed that? I think what's happening is far more fundamental. There's a recent book by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, which says that China is basically following the Soviet model. Don't get too excited about this. It's all going to collapse. I think this is wrong fundamentally. Knowing the Soviet experience, the Soviet Union did not develop in a context of globalization. And so when its crisis hit, it was not part of a global system at all. This is completely different, in my view, from China's reality, because China is developing as part of the world productive systems, the world technology systems. It's contributing to them. It's a vital part of it, which was not true of the Soviet Union. So I think the analogies are very, very weak and poor in the analysis that says it's all about to come to a screeching halt, or that this is like a Soviet buildup. I believe that China's development is driven fundamentally by technological improvements that are the same technologies as the whole world is using. That's good news from the point of view of this not being evanescent. It's not a complete answer from the point of view of us destroying the environment and the planet. And just to remind you, if China were actually to mimic the US and catch up, there would be 1 billion more cars on the road. Of course, given China's size, China would be nothing but a parking lot or a traffic jam. So there's something impossible with that scenario. But China's already the world's largest automobile market, and it's likely to remain so for the next 20 years. But China has to have a strategy that accommodates this. All of this is to say the timetable for China to just be a good player in a world system somehow managed by the US or by the G8 or by nobody, that's gone. China's now fundamentally a protagonist. Given that, we have a real issue, which is that there really are kind of 3 models of global politics that we can imagine. There could be a kind of balance of power politics, which is peaceful and mutually respectful of space and power and influence, kind of a concert of Europe vision that maybe Henry Kissinger would like, that could work. There could be a competition model in which China's growth drives the U.S. absolutely crazy, and the U.S. craze drives China into greater nationalism, and we've had that dynamic twice in the 20th century with Germany, and it's just absolutely the most risky thing that the whole world can have. And the third, which I believe, by the way, is the only thing that can work, is something we've never had before, and that's close global cooperation. The reason I think that that is necessary is that I believe that these environmental challenges are unprecedented and that they are a different kind of problem from the problems that humanity has faced in the past. In the past, humanity had enough space to leave each other more or less to do their thing, and the question was whether the kings idiotically went to war or not, or whether the rulers of the tyrants idiotically went to war. We're in a very different situation, in my view, right now, which is that we actually need to do something humanity has never done before and has no taste to do, and that is to transform fundamentally the world's energy and technology systems within the next 40 years. I say we don't have a taste to do it in the shadow of the next 2 weeks. So let me say something about the next 2 weeks. The next 2 weeks have 3 big events. One is the Greek election on Sunday, and that by itself could be the start of the biggest financial crisis, not since 2008, but since 1929. Because if the Eurozone implodes or explodes right now, the ramifications of that for the world, I think, could be extraordinary. And when Chinese major investors have said in the last few weeks, we're out of Europe right now, we'll just wait and see. And when the money is fleeing Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, in what is really a banking panic within the Eurozone taking place, it's very fragile what's happening. And if Greece, just to throw a scenario out, which you all know, but if Greece elects a government that is committed to tearing up agreements with Europe, not that I have any admiration for those agreements, but if it elects a populist government that says this is absurd, we default, and so forth, which is by no means sure, but is a possibility, The ramifications of that, in my view, would be very large, and the contagion would be not contained to Greece. I don't see any way that Greece could have a rupture within Europe, a collapse, a default, without devastating Spain, Italy, and others. That's my own macroeconomic view. So that's event number one. Then event number two was the G20 meeting in Los Cabos in Mexico, which maybe will be a great, exciting meeting to pick up the pieces after the Greek disaster. And so I'm looking forward to that meeting. I'll be there with Secretary General. I hope it will not be devoted to that. The G20 has proven to be, at some moments, rather impressive. I've been to almost all of the G20 meetings. One thing I would say about them is that the presentations of most of the leadership are strong and serious. It's actually a little frightening to be in these rooms with all the leaders there. They're not necessarily solving the problems, but the meetings are quite serious, actually, and so I've been impressed by them. But the level of cooperation and practicality that has come out of them has been extremely low. And so we've not really had practical problem solving come out of the G20, at least not since 2009. And 2009 wasn't really cooperation. It was mostly a lot of countries pointing in the same direction for their own reason, rather than a lot of cooperation. So the G20 will meet next. And then after that will be the Rio +20 summit. It's quite a lineup, because the Rio +20 summit is 20 years after the Earth Summit. The Earth Summit produced 3 major treaties, one on climate change, one on biological diversity, and one on combating desertification. Not one of these treaties had any effect, I would say, or almost any effect. They have been more or less a bonanza for conferences over 20 years. Diplomats have had a great time negotiating what's legally binding, what's measurable, what's verifiable, but nothing has changed, except that climate change has gotten worse, biological diversity has continued its collapse, and desertification has roared forward in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. So the record is miserable, actually. And to add to the misery, after the Climate Change Convention was signed and actually ratified by the U.S. Senate, believe it or not, because the U.S. Senate would never ratify anything right now. Anything that involves another country is inherently suspect in the United States, much less something for the whole world. That means that that must mean that it is absolutely a dire threat to the United States. So in 1997, the Senate voted 95-0, don't agree on anything on climate change until China does the same, basically. This was the Byrd-Hagel Amendment. That's an example of being driven a little crazy by the competition with China. Because under the law of the treaty, the U.S. was to move first. Under the practicalities, the U.S. should have moved first. Under historical responsibility, the U.S. should have moved first. Under technology, the U.S. should move first. But it was absolutely saying, we cannot move. Our competitor is gaining on us. And so this is the kind of thing that absolutely can break the logic of the system. Oh, God. It would be great if we could meet in 2 weeks and see whether we're still here and where we're going. I'll tell you what I'm hoping for. I still am hoping, maybe naively, I'm told constantly, for that cooperative approach. Because I don't really see another way, and because I actually think all of our problems even Greece and Spain, even climate change, are eminently solvable. That is what I feel is the most persistent, deeper truth of our time. We're actually in good shape in the world in the most important way, which is we have the know-how, we have the spread of literacy, awareness, information to actually solve all our problems. That's phenomenal. And the spread of information technology and connectedness is mind-boggling. The villages that we work in Africa 7 years ago didn't have a phone of any kind, and now mobile and soon 3G will be completely pervasive. Our ability to solve these problems is absolutely at hand. What I'm hoping will come out of Rio Plus 20, something that I've been working on and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is leading, is the concept that the world will adopt sustainable development goals, not for the lawyers and the diplomats, not to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, but actually for us, humanity, civil society, the people of the world, the school children, the universities, the businesses, so that we can move beyond these empty negotiations and actually move to solve real problems. And I know that that's exactly the spirit of this conference, and I know with so many friends here, it is the spirit that has engaged so many of you for many, many years. So let's keep good heart. Let's hope that Greece, the G20, and the world, in that order, in the next 2 weeks, does its job, and then we can get to the real problem solving. Thank you very much.
We can take 2 questions. Why don't I collect both questions and attend to Jeff before we go to the panel, if there's a demand. Peter.
Two questions within one question. Just on the commodity terms of trade. You mentioned the huge impact that China has had on Africa and Latin America, and surely that's importantly a supply response to the shift in the commodity terms of trade, and will bring the real price of commodities back. I'd like your comments on that because it relates to the basically limits of growth dimension to your presentation. The second one is really on global cooperation and where the locus of change might be there. I mean, you're pretty pessimistic by implication on the established forums. Where do you see it coming from? What you suggested at the end was a movement for sustainable development. That's a whole collectivity of national political agendas in some way or other. How do you do that?
I'll take one more question.
Okay, good.
It's about the adjustment in a response to what you said earlier on expansion of the economy, and then we ran into financial global crisis. So my own assumption is that if we got into big trouble, we probably need to take some pain in order to go on. But you look at around the world, most of the countries, governments, and the central banks are very reluctant to take the pains. Whenever the economy is slow, they start printing money again, expand on the fiscal deficit. In fact, the ironic thing is that the Chinese government is the only one who is talking about maybe slower growth is necessary. What's your response?
Great. Thanks a lot. So on the question of resource prices and supply, as I mentioned briefly, and as you know, over a very long period of time, roughly 150 years, real commodities prices tended to decline. And this seemed to indicate that the Malthusian fear of the finitude of the planet was somehow wrong in the sense that technology could overcome the limits that the world faces. After 1970, that downward long-term trend became quite volatile and erratic. We had high commodities prices in the 70s and limits to growth. We had a collapse of commodities prices in the 80s and 90s. Then we've had a restoration of commodities prices starting from the early 2000s. So it's a little dangerous to proclaim a new era, and the first thing that would be said is that when commodities prices are high, they elicit a supply response, they elicit substitution, they elicit new technologies. I have to say I'm a bit of a conditional Malthusian, and by conditional Malthusian I mean the following. A lot of what got the prices down over time was learning how to mine nature better. So it's not that we economized on resource use, we just were able to dig it out better and fish it out better and mine it out better and pump it out better, and so forth. And I am persuaded, certainly because I head an environmental institute as well, filled with hundreds of ecologists and climatologists and so forth, to believe that we've really reached some very serious supply challenges that can't anymore be met by better mining, pumping, dredging, and so forth. Now, in the United States, we're in the middle of a very exciting boomlet on shale gas, which is supposed to disprove this proposition. I think if you look at the numbers, you see that this is something real, but it's several parts hype for each part fundamental solution, because even if it's there, it's not really a fundamental game changer if the world economy continues to grow fast, which is by no means assured. But I'm asking the question, can the world economy continue to grow as the world hopes it will? That means developing countries catching up in a way that would be compatible with our current technology base. And I think the answer is no. Climate change will destabilize a lot of food production. Ocean acidification will destabilize marine environments. Even conventional supplies of some key resources, probably conventional petroleum, will make a big difference. Certainly the conventional supplies of fossil water will be depleted. That means the aquifers in major areas of the world, and if not fossil water, at least slowly recharging aquifers like northern China, like the Indo-Gangetic Plains, like the Ogallala Reservoir in the American Midwest, are on a downward course right now. So my view is that we've entered a new era, even with supply responses. Now, what's also true is that we have no limit to energy if we were to harness solar power on a massive scale, because insulation is about 10,000 times our energy use right now, our global power supply. We tap almost none of it. Much of it we won't be able to tap economically, but there's a lot of solar power. There's a lot of potential nuclear power. But we have huge problems to mobilize those or to accept their costs. And I'm not persuaded, therefore, that we really can avoid rising marginal cost curves for a lot of commodities right now. That's my basic take. We're $70 trillion annual production right now, with a world that, if you add it up in terms of what is seen as, quote, normal, would grow at about 4% per year. And 4% per year growth means doubling every 18 years. So by 2030, we would be at 140 trillion. And if we did that one more time, for example, which would, well, you can double it again. The point I should make is that if the whole world were to converge at the high income levels from where it is right now, and the rich countries were never to grow again, but just to stay where we are, which may be optimistic, by the way. But if that were to be the case, that would be a fourfold increase of production. And then if you add in the momentum on population, that would be another 40% or so. So we have built into the political DNA of the world maybe a sixfold increase. There's no way on current technologies that our resource base can support that, either our ecosystem services or, I believe, a lot of crucial commodities. So I think that this is a real issue that is persistent. A lot of places that grow a lot of food right now, we talk about increasing it as if we can surely hold the production, but we can't necessarily even hold the production in a lot of places as the climate changes, as the water situation gets more concerning, and so on. I'll put together these two questions of accepting pain or getting out of this, how to get out of this crisis and how to create some kind of movement of sustainable development. Oh. It's very hard because we're working on the politicians' timetables right now. And we're not working on the realities of the world right now. The United States is a great example of a country that has everything you could ever imagine, and yet seems determined to squander a lot of it. Because we can't even have a grown-up discussion in this country anymore. And the level of our political discussion is so abysmal that it's unrecognizable, in my view. The word climate probably won't be mentioned for the next 4 months. President Obama will not go to the Rio Plus 20 summit, even though 150 other world leaders will be there, because nothing could be worse for him than to attend a UN function. And so this is really bad because we need some cooperation. And if the president can't even see fit to go to a meeting where 150 or so of his counterparts are discussing the future of the planet, you can judge how difficult this environment is right now. The problem is or not the problem, the good part is the public is way ahead of the governments, actually, I believe. That may be a little optimistic, but at least partly ahead. But the noise factor is phenomenal, and the noise factor is very powerful corporate lobbies, which finance most of the noise, and which are absolutely out to confuse everybody on just about everything. And this, if companies would behave themselves, that would take us about 80% of where we need to go. Because nothing has done more damage in the United States than corporate propaganda, and everything is propagandized right now. Every political message is driven by big money, and it's all confusion, top to bottom. There's not a sensible message in it. And we built a world, and China's becoming increasingly comfortable and part of it, of tax havens and hiding income. And you look at where most of China's overseas foreign development goes. It's the British Virgin Islands, it's the Cayman Islands, it's Hong Kong, and it's other tax havens. And this is the phony world that the real world is supposed to live on and solve our problems. No one's immune to big money in politics, and it's the most destructive thing of all. Because if people would actually understand the problems, be explained, and told what's at stake for their children, we'd actually solve these problems. So that's why I come back to the idea of more of a social movement and an educational movement and an awareness movement rather than a political movement. I've been part of something called the Millennium Development Goals for the last 12 years. And while those to fight poverty, hunger, and disease, while they haven't succeeded, they've succeeded a lot more than those 3 international treaties. They've had real effect because the lawyers and the diplomats weren't discussing what's legally binding, what's verifiable, who has to do what. It was a call to action globally that has resonated quite deeply. My view is most of the world would like a future for the planet, future for their children, future for climate change. Most of the world would like to tap renewable energy. We have a lot of polling data to show all these things. And we can't get it done because of the big money in politics right now. And so if we can put society back to where it's supposed to be, and this is no matter what form of government, democracy, non-democracy, this is really about voice of people versus voice of interests. We don't have a working system right now. And I'll just end by telling you one story. That 95-0 resolution in the Byrd-Hagel Amendment, which said we won't do anything until the developing countries do, was the basic amendment. And every senator signed up to this. One of the authors of it was Robert Byrd, who was in many ways a great senator. Byrd gave a speech on climate change one day, which is completely remarkable. He was the senator of West Virginia. West Virginia is a major coal state. And he gave a speech. I need to dig it out again because it was so stunning. It was 2 pages in the congressional congressional record, which said climate change is the most important issue for the world, for our children. It threatens the whole planet. It's terrible. It's disaster, and so forth. And he literally 2 pages, and the last paragraph is, therefore, it is with great regret that I will have to vote against this legislation. And the reason he was voting against it was he represented a coal state, and he could count the interests and so forth. And everything was there except the vote at the end. And this is a little bit what we face with the politicians. And if we can bring the people to the forefront, we can help the politicians out of their agony right now. I have no doubt that President Obama would love to talk morning, noon, and night about climate, and I have little doubt that he won't even mention the word for the next 4 months. And that's our problem that we have to help solve. Thanks.
Usually don't maximize collective interest and therefore their own happiness at the end of the day. And something even more recently we realize is that people make tremendous mistakes in the pursuit of their own self-interest. So one thing we can do, we start to do a little bit, is to think, well, how can we help people to do these things a little better? So you can tweak the incentives a little bit here, provide better information a little bit there, maybe force people to do things that they might not think about doing on their own, for example, getting immunized, and in this way make the welfare of everybody better. And I think this role of economists has been underplayed, and this is high time that we spend a little bit more time thinking along this line of making economics a normative science.
One of the things you've done is help change the way economists and policymakers think about aid to developing countries. And aside from the standard complaints about corruption and waste, what is wrong with the traditional IMF and World Bank approach?
Well, one issue is that money is being spent, when it is being spent, maybe not enough money is being spent, surely not enough money is being spent, but even when it is spent without thinking very hard about how it should be spent, and without really monitoring the impacts of whatever we are doing. And the result is that the world of aid, but generally the world of development policy, has this tendency of going from fad to fad. So there have been the dams fad, and then the bridge fad, and then the school fad, and then the microcredit fad. And these things move like fashion in New York. And we're never learning about what have been the positive sides, about what has been done, what has been the negative sides. And usually there is a little bit of both. And usually you could do a little better with building dams or with building schools or having teachers in the schools. And those lessons are never really drawn. And one of the things that we are really trying to do in Poverty Action Lab is to work with actors, with the World Bank, but mainly with governments, developing country governments, and NGOs, and small people, and firms, try to understand what will work better to address whatever problems they have in mind, be it getting kids into school, or teaching them something, or immunizing them, or improving agricultural productivity.
Talk just for a minute about some of the incentives that you've used to get children to school. It's a form of bribery, more or less.
So bribery is not so much, bribery to get children into school is not really the approach that in the end I am advocating, but this is the way the world is thinking now in a way. That the main problem to get kids into school is that parents refuse to send them to school, and therefore we have to bribe parents to do it. And that's the idea behind the very, very popular now conditional cash transfer program, where you basically take away people's social transfer if they don't send their kids to school. So that's kind of the main idea that is out there. Or maybe giving them free uniforms or things like that. What is interesting is that, so what we are doing in Poverty Action Lab is that we are trying to rigorously test those various ideas. And you can test many, many ways to achieve the same thing. So for example, when you test many, many ways to get children into school, what you learn is that maybe that's not, bribing parents is not the key thing, because a lot of parents have already bought in the whole education idea. And what works better, at least better for their money, is to tell them the value of education. So you just explain to them how much more the kid can earn and how many fewer kids they will have and how healthier those kids will be if they stay in school a bit longer. You have small effect on enrollment, but since it costs nothing to do that, the value for the money is huge. And interestingly, the cheapest thing you can do to get kids into school is something that Jeff has been advocating, is to treat their intestinal worms. So bribing kids to go to school in the Progressa program to get an extra year of school will cost you $1,000. If you deworm children, you just give them a pill every 6 months so they don't have intestinal worms, that will cost you $3 per year to get $3 per extra year of school. So in fact, in this case, bribing is sort of not the most effective way, since people seem to be convinced it's making sure kids are actually healthy enough to go to school.
Jeff, does this jive with your approach to aid in the developing world?
Yeah, very, very much so. And the fact is that each place, of course, differs, has its own priorities, has its own specifics. There's a tremendous amount that's known. I think it's important for Americans to understand what an outlier we are also in not acting properly. We're now spending 18 cents out of every $100 on development aid. So of our $100 of national income, we allocate 18 cents for the poor countries of the world. Half of that is for war zones, and about 4 cents is for Africa. And it's shockingly wrong how we don't pay attention, because when you work in these countries and when you work on the ground, a tremendous amount is known, and a tremendous number of lives can be saved. And if you want to know why Somalia has pirates, it's not a burst of bad behavior. It's a very hungry water-stressed region that can't even maintain a government anymore. It's fallen into such disarray. And then we get together with others and propose military approaches to this. So there's basically a very serious misunderstanding in this country of this whole issue. But mostly, it's just profound neglect. It's not taken seriously. Many people think, well, there are just too many people on the planet. It's not our job to help save them. They don't understand that that's going to actually lead to a lot more population growth than actually taking care of people and helping them to be healthy and have access to family planning and other things. So we've gone on this way now for almost 40 years in this country. This is a very tired discussion, not our discussion, but a tired discussion in our public. Maybe this is also tired, but you know, you asked me, how can you convince people? Well, somehow we just found $4 trillion for Wall Street, for the banks, for bailouts, for TARP, for TALF, for $4 trillion. We haven't found one penny yet for poor people.
Talk a little bit about...
That's something seriously wrong with our society, by the way. And we're not in good shape in this country because we really have gotten off the rails in terms of the most basic standards of normal thinking.
And yet we have a new president who I think would agree with absolutely everything you've just said. What do you think about his budget and also what was or wasn't accomplished at the G20 summit?
Well, I've talked to him about it, and I think he would like to see more, but I think he and his colleagues feel that Congress is an obstacle, the American people are an obstacle. I'd like to see some leadership to explain to the American people why it's real. You know, many times I've faced this same, or a claim, you know, at the end of the Clinton administration, we can't cancel debt. This was, you know, Congress will never approve it. And actually, Congress was ahead of President Clinton in that because they didn't understand in the White House at the time that if you explain what the real choices are, it's possible to make coalitions. I went to the White House in February 2001 to meet Condi Rice to talk about AIDS treatment. And I said, we need $3 billion a year. I was laughed out of the White House at the time. They ended up doing a $3 billion a year program, which is saving a vast number of lives. People don't know what's possible, what isn't, because we don't have a public discussion of this issue. This issue has not been discussed in the American public. There wasn't one question about poor countries in any of the presidential debates. In the vice presidential debate, the only thing that was said in the entire campaign is, well, we may not be able to reach our doubling of aid because of the crisis. That was the only word that was said.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about Rwanda. We had a piece in the magazine recently by Philip Gurevich, and he talked about he described it as probably the most astonishing success story in Africa. He is a recipient of foreign aid, but he speaks strenuously about the need to be self-sufficient. And I know some of your critics have talked about the need for self-sufficiency throughout many countries in Africa. Dambisa Moyo makes a similar case for Africa in her book, Dead Aid. And she has criticized celebrities like Bono who go over there, and then she talks about the kind of neo-colonialist approach. What do you say to them?
This is so phony. Kagame depends on aid and knows it, and finds it very convenient to say we need to be self-sufficient as long as he's getting in a lot of aid. So there's a level of phoniness that is so big in all of this. Of course, everyone wants self-sufficiency. No one wants aid. This is, you know, and also let millions of people die. Fine. You know, it's absolutely absurd and trivial, this stuff. You go to very poor people, they can't buy bed nets. I've known this for a long time, and Esther's lab proved it. Okay, I've seen this, you know, all my career. Poor people can't afford a bed net. You give them a bed net, they use it, and malaria goes down. We've got malaria down 90% throughout the villages where we're working. It's obvious stuff. This stuff is trivial.
it's made into this great argument, so Dambisa Moyo would leave 1 million children to die. She's ignorant. I'm sorry. I was her teacher also, but I certainly didn't.
So it's your fault.
I guess it is. I acknowledge it. I guess she said, "Oh, Professor Sachs, you didn't teach me this. You taught me about a market economy." That's nonsense, actually, because what I did teach her, and what I taught others, is you have a market economy, but you also have responsibility, and you combine the two. And when she was my student, I was also talking about canceling debts of Poland or canceling debts of Bolivia, because you can't leave people to suffer on this planet without massive pain and also without massive destabilization for the rest of the world. And that's what she should have heard in the classroom, not this nonsense that you leave poor people to their fate. You know, there are 9 million children dying every year of their extreme poverty right now. And this is a kind of decadence of our society that we can't understand this thing. This is really messed up, actually.
Esther, I see you nodding your head. So Bono is a good thing for Africa, not a bad thing, as some people have said.
Definitely a good thing. I think there is a huge confusion between the long run and the short run. So there is the idea that you have to leave people on their own, because this way they will they will find the whole genius of their nation and figure out what's good for them and how they want to grow their own country. Because we have no idea really what sparks a huge, rapid growth. And if we knew how to do that, that would be fantastic. And then we would do that, and then the whole aid issue would be resolved. We don't know how to do that. And there are some people working on that. That's great. They should use their energy on that. But in the meantime, what do we do? So there are 27 million children who are not immunized. So if you tell them, it's okay, we have to leave it to your own, the genius of your nation to figure out the solution for your nation, what's good is going to do to them if they die of a vaccine-preventable disease in the meantime? There's this like catchphrase of Keynes that economists like to repeat all the time, like in the long run we'll be dead. So when you think about developing countries, that's not a joke. It's like absolutely true. Like in the long run, these people will be dead. So the whole notion that we should not interfere with the process of the market because that will allow the nation to find their own genius is preposterous for this generation, especially when there are things that can be done. And so that's why I think we need to be working on finding out what works. So what do you do to get these 27 million children immunized? Do you need to fix the supply? Do you need to fix the demand? If you fix the demand, how do you do that? Is it where like these little bribes can be helpful and things like that? And the whole idea that this won't take any money doesn't make any sort of sense.
Unlike many economists, you do get out in the field, and your research builds on what you find there. Could you talk a little bit about what you learned when you were working with the women in India who were elected in their villages to help run the village?
So that's like a very interesting case, because we tend to think, there are these ideas that having more women in government would be a good thing. In fact, Rwanda has a lot of women in government, and we tend to think that would be nice, and on the other hand, it's very difficult to prove. And so while a lot of countries have had some rules to ensure that some women are elected, it's hard to know whether or not it has made a difference. And then it turned out that India has decided to run this nationwide experiment by saying that in each village, 1/3 of each village at each election can only elect a woman. So at each election, 1/3 of the villages are randomly selected, and they can only elect a woman. Something that seems preposterous here, but actually there are about 100 countries that have similar laws. So what we did is we go to those villages, and when you stay in the capital, people say, oh, this is horrible, because in fact those women are standing for their husbands or their brother or their in-laws or whatever, and they are really not doing anything, and this is bad for democracy, in fact. Think, fine, let's go and see. And so what we did is we started by collecting information on what women and men are really interested in. So the big surprise, that's not actually a surprise at all, is that women are really keen to get drinking water. And so that's really what women are interested in. And sure enough, when you go to those villages and after 5 years, what do you notice? Well, there are many more are drinking water wells in places where women are the head. So what do you learn? It's actually women are powerful, they do the work. The second thing we learn is that initially, if you ask people in the villages, what do you think of the policy? They respond to you that they're upset, men in particular, that they don't like to have a woman in power, that women are incompetent. But if you're a little bit more subtle, that is, for example, if you get them to listen to a speech, which is the same speech given by either a man or a woman, and you tell them, what do you think of the speech? People who've never been exposed to one of these women politicians will tell you that the speech pronounced by a woman is worse, showing that they are discriminating because, of course, it's the same speech. But after a cycle of exposure to one of those women who was imposed on them, that difference has entirely gone away, which is also telling us that people learn. It has consequences because now women are much more likely to be elected without the quota after you have had a woman in politics. So this is also like one more thing that you take this short-term measure thinking, okay, we are going to fix a problem, which is women have no representation, and therefore important things that drinking water don't get done. And then it has these trickle-down effects as well. So you're not really sacrificing the long run for the short run. You do today what you can do. And then this has those kind of ripple effects, like trickle up instead of trickle down, if you want.
So that is the trick of getting economic growth, let women run things. Which,
exactly.
Which is absolutely what we see also. I think it's... I'm in 100% agreement with that.
Jeff, I also want to ask you, you advocate combining economic development with environmental sustainability. But as we've seen in China and India, the rapid growth there has been in large part due to non-enviro-friendly means, such as coal-burning plants. How do you reconcile, or how do you make those two aims work together?
Well, I think it's not easy, and we have to acknowledge that. Electricity is a fundamental input to economic development. There's just no question about it, no exception to it. And China's main primary energy source is coal, and it's very likely to remain coal. So what's the answer of reconciling economic development and environment? It probably will require new technologies that focus on for example, in the case of coal, capturing and safely sequestering the carbon dioxide from a coal-fired power plant. We know markets won't do this on their own because it's free to dispose of carbon dioxide in the air. We know that the early science and demonstration to do this won't be done by the markets, even if there were prices attached to carbon disposal, because there's a lot of public goods, so-called, to science, which is that somebody bears the upfront research costs and everybody else gets the benefits. So the lesson of all of this in economics is don't leave the environment to the market. The market by itself won't solve these problems, though you can use market tools. Don't leave technology to the market, because the market by itself won't provide the incentives. And don't believe that this is an easy problem, because it isn't an easy problem. There is no simple answer to this conundrum. And we in this country, which have been throughout history up until about 6 months ago the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, just overtaken by China, incidentally. They're 4 times bigger in population. We're one-fourth of the per capita income of the per capita emissions. They've just overtaken us in the aggregate. We've done nothing so far. And one of the shocking things that we haven't done is it was realized already a decade ago that we needed to test whether a coal-fired power plant actually could capture its carbon dioxide and put it underground, what's called carbon capture and sequestration. So in 2001, the government proposed this. In 2008, they canceled it. In 2009, it's in the budget again. But in the time that it took us in the 60s to go to the moon and back, we couldn't build one power plant to test this proposition. Something's wrong in this country, really badly wrong. What got wrong is that we abandoned all collective actions. We abandoned development aid, we abandoned development for the environment. We let Wall Street do everything till they put us into this misery. And now we have to decide whether we're going to get back to something where the market does something and the non-market does something, like Esther said. And that's a basic choice for us. That seems, of course, to be where President Obama would like to lead, and I 100% support it. But there's a big, strong contingent, I think, including part of his economic team, that just somehow want to get back to where we were before. And that won't work. And so this question that you ask has no known solution right now. Yet, if we don't find a solution, the planet's going to be devastated.
To talk about another terrifying issue. Tell us about...
Isn't this cheery?
It is. We'll try to end on a more upbeat note. National security. Well, we've just come out of an administration for 8 years which talked about terrorism, the threat of terrorism nonstop. You see poverty, extreme poverty, as a threat to national security. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Look, we gave $12 billion to Pakistan during the Bush administration, all $12 billion to buy fighter jets and military equipment. And so how much security did we get out of that? You got the Taliban 60 miles from the capital, and you got a nuclearized society nearly in chaos right now. It's idiotic to think that hungry people facing climate shocks, demographic pressures, are going to be able to somehow be stabilized by our military approaches, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's strafing people in Somalia, or any of the other things that we're doing of that sort. We've not invested in development in any of these places all along. I see them all the time. I'm in these places. People are hungry. People don't have what to eat. People can't keep their children alive. They can't get the children to school. They can't feed their children. So how are we going to get stability out of that? By sending in the military. And what are we doing right now? We're spending $700 billion on the military. We have the Democrats right now, $94 billion supplemental. It's still going on to this moment. They just added in new weapon systems again. $94 billion for a supplemental right now. Our aid to Africa is about $5.5 billion total.
Can I interrupt you? Because we're running out of time.
Absolutely.
And I want to end on a...
So the answer is... No, sorry, yeah. just to
yes.
conclude. We really, really need change. You know? That's why we elected President Obama.
Quickly, we'll start with you, Esther, and then I want you to answer the same question. What can we, a now humbled, one hopes, wealthy nation, learn from the work that you have done in the developing world? And maybe just take one, either in healthcare or education, one of the areas that you've spent some time thinking about.
I think we can learn, so one is we can learn resilience. I mean, many people asked what is going to happen to the poor countries now and to poor people in poor countries with the crisis. The truth is that, yes, the crisis is going to affect poor countries, but as it is, they are subject to so many shocks anyway that this is kind of not going to make such a huge difference to the type of life, to the qualitative difference to the type of life they already have. And in the face of that, they are moving along and doing the best they can. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is to not take anything for granted, and in particular, not take anything that hasn't been done as a proof that it cannot be done. I think we all too often think along the line that, oh, if nobody has tried out this solution, it's probably because it's a bad one. But in fact, thinking with this term like laissez-faire approach, thinking that, oh, if there was $100 on the sidewalk, someone would have taken it already. And that view is wrong because a lot of dollar bills are left on the sidewalk just by lack of imagination, in part because, as Jeff was saying on the environment, a lot of the market doesn't reward imagination all that much, in the sense that often the biggest thing that we can discover are things that have benefits for a lot of people, and there is no incentive for anybody left to their own device to discover that thing. We need a little bit of collective action. And I think what we have learned from the work that we've done in developing countries is that often it doesn't take that much to really improve the life of very many people. And I think it's some kind of optimism. I'm optimistic in the sense that I think a lot of things can be done, and it's not that hard, as long as you are a little bit ingenious in finding them, and a little bit willing to get wrong and be corrected and move again, get up again and move again the other way. And that's the thing that this country is a little bit too cautious to do sometimes.
But what about healthcare, Jeff?
Yeah, I was going to mention, in the 1980s, the U.S. And the World Bank went over and told Africa, impoverished, disease-burdened continent, the solution to healthcare is you should charge for health services. Privatize your health services. Honest to God, this is a good way to kill a lot of people, by the way. And they did. And as soon as you charge in an impoverished community at a point of service, you lose 40 or 50% of the population who can't afford it. Same is true here. We've got this absolutely absurd system. The other big reason why we've elected this great president that we have. We've got a system where we price the poor out of the market the same way. It's the same deal. Either we view people as part of society and their health as a human